National Observer columnist Max Fawcett wrote an excellent column yesterday in which he nailed Alberta's single biggest fake grievance. Referring to an op-ed by Diane Francis, an editor-at-large for the National Post, Max wrote, "To hear Francis and others tell it, the current Liberal government has single-handedly stood between the province and its rightful status as a global oil and gas superpower." Ah, yes, Alberta's rightful status as a global oil and gas superpower. Check out global oil production stats. The United States is number one by a long shot. Russia and Saudi Arabia are tied for second and third. Then Canada, which is mostly Alberta, is a distant fourth. Yet Alberta has the third largest oil reserves in the world, and contrary to common opinion, relatively low production costs. But it's the only one of the four producers that is landlocked, hemmed in and frustrated by uncooperative governments in Ottawa and British Columbia, among others. Alberta yearns to wear long pants and sit at the adults' table, but is perpetually consigned to short pants. That, in my opinion, is the headwaters, the source of Alberta's resentment. But what can be done about it? Max and I discuss some options. Welcome to the interview, Max.
Thanks for having me here.
You wrote a really good column in yesterday's National Observer. Alberta's grievances aren't actually reasonable, and it echoes a lot of my own thoughts and our analysis here at Energy Media. Why don't you give us an overview of the column?
Sure. The separatist conversation is obviously alive and unwell here. We're bombarded all the time by politicians and pundits saying, "Oh, Alberta would be better off on its own." And undergirding that is this belief that Alberta has been consistently screwed over by Ottawa, and it's not just conservatives who are doing it. It's not just Danielle Smith. It's not just the folks at the Western Standard. Jason Kenney, even in fighting for Canada, he's been very good at going after the separatists, but he has spread this message for years. He clearly believes it that the Liberal government has been attacking Alberta, has been attacking its oil and gas industry. Even Naheed Nenshi, the leader of the Alberta NDP, in a recent video, essentially echoed that argument that the deal with Confederation is unfair. Alberta is not treated properly. We should be able to get our resources to market. And I just think that willingness to accept Danielle Smith's framing is really, really dangerous and just factually incorrect. The idea that Alberta is being screwed over by Canada is not supported by any of the facts. Whether it's the complaints around not having enough seats in the House of Commons, equalization, or the main event, which is the oil and gas industry, and the fact that the idea that it has been suppressed, attacked, killed by Ottawa's climate policies. It is just like an alternative reality, but it is one that doesn't go challenged here and often enough. It certainly doesn't go challenged by conservatives, and it rarely gets challenged by progressives. And I think there just has to be a more concerted effort to say, look, we hear your frustration, but we need to talk about what has actually happened. We need to ground this in reality if we're going to actually address people's concerns in a realistic way.
I'll give you an example that from my own experience in having this conversation with Albertans, and like you, that when they push back and say, no, we're getting screwed by Ottawa, I say, well, look, what about pipelines? You've got, Trans Mountain expansion, you've got Line 3. There is almost 1 million barrels a day of new shipping capacity. And they will go, yeah, but we didn't get all five of them. And what they mean is, Keystone XL, Energy East, and Northern Gateway, and they blame the Liberals unfairly for the cancellation of those projects. And so every time you bring up an example of where Ottawa has actually either helped or not done what they are claiming to do, they come back with these ridiculous arguments that just aren't grounded. There's no basis in fact for them.
Yeah, they live or they cling to this sort of version of reality where, okay, sure, the Liberals bought TMX, and okay, sure, they might have done some things, but if they hadn't been in our way, we would be at 9 million barrels per day of production rather than five, or we would have seven LNG terminals instead of one. And it's just it's not realistic. all you have to do is look at the price of commodities over the time the Liberals have been in government. There was no business case for more pipelines. There was no business case for more LNG terminals. But they don't have to engage with that because they can create this sort of fictional alternative world where if only the dastardly liberals and their dreaded climate policies weren't there, we would be Saudi Arabia or we would be Russia. We would be an energy superpower. And again, there has not been enough of an effort on the part of progressives who regrettably tend to not be very well educated on this subject to push back and just sort of say no, like there's no factual basis for that. Look at the price of oil, look at the price of gas, look at the decline in investment in Texas, look at the decline in employment in Texas. Like there, I can count on two hands the number of progressives in Alberta that can make those arguments. And so they go unchallenged. And it takes root in people's mind and it becomes very difficult to disentangle. And then you have conservative politicians who, mine that for grievance, mine that for anger and donations and support. And we get to a point where it's impossible, or it's at least very difficult, to have a realistic conversation about what has actually happened over the last 10 years.
Now, you've been a journalist for a long time, and so I'd like to have this conversation with you because it revolves around when you call somebody a liar, and I'll explain the context here. Generally, journalists are reluctant to call anybody a liar because we can't know what's going on in their head. They might have made a mistake, they might have misspoken, and so that we're very, very careful about that. Donald Trump changed everything because the volume of lies and the egregiousness of those lies, there's just, I mean, it got to the point where we have to say, okay, the guy's a liar and you can't believe most of what he says. I would argue by that standard that Danielle Smith is a liar. And I've said this publicly in videos. And I would also argue that Brian Jean and Rebecca Schultz, the energy minister and environment minister, respectively, who basically echo whatever she says, are in the same camp. And I'm just curious as a journalist what you think of that argument.
I suppose I'm less interested in the why of what they're saying than the what of what they're saying. Whether they say these things because they actually believe them, or whether they say them because they know they're not true but see value in them politically, they're still saying them and they're still incorrect. And as a public official, you have a responsibility to be as truthful as possible with the information you communicate. Now, again, maybe they don't. Donald Trump has sort of proven that there's no penalty for being a liar. There's no political cost to just making stuff up. And it does feel sometimes like some of the senior officials in the Alberta government are taking their inspiration from that they can just sort of whole cloth create this alternative reality that suits their politics, and there's going to be no real cost to it. Especially, as most mainstream outlets are, a fraction of what they used to be, and the ones that are operating in Alberta kind of seem to be in cahoots with the UCP, or certainly more than happy to carry their water on this stuff. And so the public just does not get a reality-based version of what has happened. They get a grievance-based version. And it is sort of poisoning the discourse here. It is poisoning our politics. And the thing I worry about is, OPEC is now flooding the market again. You and I can disagree on when it happens, but we are getting close to the point where demand for oil is going to peak. And we need to be having serious conversations in Alberta about how we prepare for that. What are the sacrifices we need to make? What are the choices we need to make? Instead, we're just having this conversation that presumes that if only the right government is elected in Ottawa, everything will be better. And look, all you have to do is look back to the 9 years of a Stephen Harper government to understand that that is not how it works. They were in power for 9 years. They built zero pipelines to Pacific Tidewaters, zero LNG terminals. They killed the income trust structure, which vaporized billions of dollars in shareholder wealth in the oil and gas sector. They were an objectively bad government for the oil and gas sector. And yet people seem to think that a conservative government, just like the last one, will somehow solve all their problems. It is dangerous. And I worry that, by the time we actually have that serious conversation about the choices we have to make, Danielle Smith will be long gone. And we will be in a far worse position than we ever needed to be.
Danielle Smith has said on a number of occasions that she would like to see the Alberta oil production double. Now, it's currently at 4 million barrels a day, and about 3.3 per 3.4, somewhere in there is the heavy crude, the ultra, from the oil sands. So that's the only source of growth that's possible out of Alberta. So if you were to add 4 million barrels more to the global market, the market for heavy crude is only 10 million. Alberta already dominates it at 3.3, 3.4. So outside of North America, you only have demand of 4.5 million barrels a day. Is she suggesting that Alberta will push Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela, and just push them out of the market? I mean, the argument on a prima facie basis is ridiculous, and nobody ever pushes back.
Yeah, I mean it's ludicrous. Um, maybe if it was the early 2000s, you could make a case there that this isn't a crazy thing to want to do. Um, Again, when you have peak demand for oil, sort of within the next 5 to 10 years, and when you have OPEC suddenly increasing production to drive prices down, the idea of doubling oil and gas production or oil production in Alberta is it's it's a suicide mission. There is no economic case for it. It would be ruinous to the shareholders of those companies, and that's why you do not hear this from the executives of these companies. They don't want to double production, um, and their shareholders sure as hell don't want to double production. I mean, you see this in the States even before Trump got elected. The shareholders of the big oil companies there were saying, "Can you please stop producing so much oil? Can you slow down on the growth and start giving us back our money? Because we're a little worried about the impact longer term of this whole climate change thing. It might have an impact on demand. Just focus on making money and not just growing all the time." And Danielle Smith does not appear to have paid any attention to that, and seems to think that our oil companies want to double production. It would be interesting to get them in a room, with Chatham House rules or something, and see what they actually think. But they won't say it in public because they're cowards, and they believe the same things that she does, that the federal government, is getting in their way and causing all their problems. But they don't want to double production, and the idea that Alberta ever could in this current market is just a fantasy.
Um, I've been involved, like you, in the Alberta energy debate for a long, long time. And one of the things I've noticed, because we interact with professionals that work in the oil and gas industry or are connected closely to it. And out of all the conversations, I can honestly say I have never had one of those individuals bring evidence and data to the conversation. It's all narrative and myth. That's all they do. They keep repeating it. And uh, it it's troubling to me that a province that is, I mean, literally Canada is the fifth, fourth largest oil producer in the world, that these myths get into politics and sometimes even into policy. And that seems to be a very irrational way to run an industry and to run, the government that sets the policy for it.
It is on one level. Um, on another level, if you look at it from the perspective of the people who run these companies, they have no interest in what happens 15 years down the road. To them, like they're gone, they're retired, they're in Kelowna, they are just trying to get as much money into their pockets as possible before they retire. And this is I've talked about this before. This is a big problem in the oil and gas industry, especially because there is a clear mismatch between what is best for these companies and their shareholders over the long run and what's best for them over the next few years, and best for the people running the companies. And the government's job is supposed to be to uh, bridge those gaps and to make sure that these companies are not mortgaging the future and by extension the future of the province just to make their current managers and current shareholders wealthy. And they are doing the exact opposite, right? They are all in with the current management, the current executives, filling their pockets and mortgaging the future. And that should be a bigger topic of conversation. The problem is, and I've talked to people in the NDP privately about this. they are not doing their job as opposition. Their job as opposition is to seed this conversation, to create spaces and places where people can talk about these issues so that it bubbles up organically through these organizations and through the culture. And they don't do that because they don't understand how to talk about it with a couple of very notable exceptions. They don't have the personnel to talk about it. And so there is nobody who is creating the conversation that needs to happen around this issue the way that the right constantly is astroturfing conversations they want to have happen. Paying organizations, creating lobby groups, whatever it might be. The left, the NDP in particular, does not do that. And so we have this one-sided debate, this one-sided conversation that suits the government, suits current executives, and totally screws over the province and future generations. Great work, guys.
I had Bill Whitelaw, who's a veteran of the oil and gas media based in Calgary, on my podcast last year, and he'd written a piece about how the oil and gas industry in Alberta needs to get better at telling its story. It needs better narratives. And I said, Bill, you guys are the biggest narrative machine in the history of the war. I mean, you spend the amount of money you spend and the amount of support you get from the government and the amount of the trade associations and the AstroTurf organ. Nobody has a narrative machine the way you guys have a narrative machine. And yet, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that they control the narrative and have an undue influence on it, still there's the sense of that they are aggrieved.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty consistent through line in conservative politics. You look at the United States right now. Um, you have folks trying to pretend that the real discrimination is against white people, and the real victims are privileged white men, and like it's just the people who are in power have this need to feel like they're the ones who don't have the power, and yeah, you see that in the oil and gas industry. I remember when I was covering it, sort of hearing those conversations about how, oh, if we just had the right storytellers and we just had the right narrative. And I'd always say to them, like, no, you need to change your story. The problem is not the people telling the story. The problem is the story is not very good, right? That you have not actually done a very good job of reducing your emissions. I believe Pembina had a recent analysis that said that per barrel emissions in the oil sands are actually up since 2017. So you picked all the low-hanging fruit around sort of economies of scale and certain sort of upstream technologies around how you generate steam, and all the real hard work is the work you don't want to do because it costs money. And so you can have all the storytellers in the world, you can pay all the social media people in the world. If your story is not great, the people outside of your bubble are not going to buy into it. As ever, for me at least, the answer for the oil and gas industry is just reduce your fucking emissions. Just do the work. Stop talking about it. Stop complaining that you're not appreciated, and people in Ontario and Quebec don't love you enough, and you're not talked about nicely enough by the Prime Minister. Just do your job. But they seem determined to do anything but their job. Look at pathways. Look at the investments in carbon capture projects. They're still ragging the puck on it. Because at the end of the day, the only conclusion I can draw is that a lot of them think that this climate change stuff is going to go away, that they don't actually have to do the work, and it's not work that's worth doing, and that's the nut of it.
I can tell you that because I've read the OPEC's World Oil Outlook, the last two of them, and there's a theme in their analysis and their assumptions that the government's commitment to climate policies around the world will weaken because they can't afford it. And there just isn't any public support for it. And the more I read of OPEC's narrative, the more I see it reflected in Smith, in the oil and gas CEOs. I mean, they are literally, spouting what OPEC's messaging. Um, I wanted to ask you this question, Max, because you and I, like I said, we've been involved in the conversation, but how do we change the conversation so that it is more fact-based and less myth-based?
Like I said a few minutes ago, it has to be from the bottom up. So there are not enough spaces, physical and otherwise, where people are having fact-based conversations about this stuff. right? And so I can go on social media, I can go on Twitter and do a thread and fact check people, um, and it's fine, but it's not enough. It needs to happen organically in the oil and gas industry, outside the oil and gas industry, from the bottom up. And so that means the NDP has to do more work here. It means foundations and organizations have to put some money to work here to create an environment where people can talk about these things factually, have speaker series, have folks from the oil and gas industry who understand these things and can talk about them, brief their peers, de-risk it for people so they can, when someone spouts up in a meeting and says, oh, this is all the, fucking liberals' fault, they can say, well, actually, it's not, and here's why. Here are all the reasons why. It's a lot more complicated than that. Um, you have the oil and gas industry and its proxies spending enormous amounts of money and political capital on this, and you have the other side spending almost nothing. And until that gap is closed, it's going to be really hard for the people who wanted to have the fact-based conversation to get it out into the air, get it out into the water.
What do we make of the fact that the industry penalizes critics? I can't tell you the dozens of professionals I've talked about who work inside the industry and who are concerned about the company's attitudes towards the future, towards the environment, towards emissions, those sorts of things. And they say, I have to keep my head down, my nose clean. I can't say anything. I could be blackballed. I could lose my job. I could be penalized in my, career advancement. And he said, I just can't say a word. And there's a chill on the conversation that you are suggesting we need to have.
Totally. It's a huge issue. And part of the way you deal with it is strength in numbers. It's easier to stand up, it's easier to stand up as a group of 100 than one. And there has to be some resources put behind efforts to de-risk that for the people who work in the industry. It is asking too much of an engineer or someone who works in the industry to take a stand on this stuff by themselves because you're right. They're right. They would be punished. It wouldn't be explicit. It wouldn't be like you're fired for saying that, but they would just get passed over for a promotion. They would get passed over for work they want to do, and their career would suffer. And it's not rational for them to stick their neck out like that. But if you can create an environment where, first of all, people are talking about it, then, maybe some people are more willing to stick their necks out. At the end of the day, it has to be people with seniority, with power, who are willing to create a permission structure for people underneath them to do the same thing. But it all starts from the bottom. It all starts from creating this sort of soup of ideas and conversations where it becomes safe to think these things and then talk about these things. And that's just not being created right now.
I have a little anecdote to illustrate your point. So a couple of years ago, I was going to interview Kendall Dilling, the head of the Pathways Alliance. And prior to the interview, one of their media people took me out for coffee and we were chatting about this. And he said, you're perceived within the industry to be very hostile to it. And I said, man, I am not hostile. I'm a critic of your industry. And that's a there's a difference between hostile, want to shut it down, phase it out, whatever, and saying you have problems and these are the problems and here are how serious they are, here are the implications of them, et cetera, et cetera. And it gave him pause, but I don't think it changed his mind because in that industry, in the political culture in Alberta, criticizing the industry is criticizing an identity, and that's a huge problem for changing the conversation the way you're talking.
Absolutely. It is yeah, to criticize the industry is to criticize, Mother Alberta. And yeah, it can cost you professionally. You can be ostracized from your peers at work. And it's probably uncomfortable because a lot of these people have grown up maybe believing a lot of the stuff about how virtuous and uh, decent the industry is. And to be clear, like by and large, it is filled with good people doing good work. It's just not as good as they want to tell people it is, right? They are not the most ethical oil producer in the world. Sorry, folks. That's Norway. Norway's got you beat there. They got you done and dusted. Um, and comparing yourself to murderous regimes in the Middle East is the lowest of bars, and yet people have been sort of patting themselves on the back with that for years. And so it does require a bit of a culture change. And that I think that will happen with time. The problem is by the time it happens, it will be too late. And so number one, we need leaders in the industry to step forward and make a place for this. And in some respects, we've gone backwards on that. I remember when I was first covering the industry more than 10 years ago, you had CEOs like Suzanne West who ran oil and gas companies and talked about it the way we talk about it. Talked about, there is going to be an endpoint of oil. And I welcome that. I drive an electric car and sadly she passed away from cancer, but like no one has filled her boots. No one has stepped into her shoes. Where are the other Suzanne Wests who are willing to say like, look, we're here to make money, to create a return for our shareholders and to make the world a better place, but we're not going to bullshit ourselves about what we're doing, and we're going to be honest about the fact that we can do it better. Um, and instead, it's the industry is filled with sadly like old white dudes who all go to the same clubs, all go to the same parties, all think the same things, and it's just real dangerous, toxic stuff.
I would agree. And I want to wrap up the interview this way, Max, because I know you spend a lot of time talking about the last 10 years of the Trudeau government and their energy policies. Now we've got a new government with a new Prime Minister, Mark Carney. And Carney himself is kind of dancing on that knife's edge. We're going to do conventional energy, but is that a pipeline? Maybe yes, maybe no. It's kind of still unclear. His energy minister, Tim Hodgson, however, was in Calgary last week, and I think the message from him was much more positive. At least that's the way it was perceived. And I wonder the extent to which uh, Carney and Hodgson might actually continue that sort of friendly relation. No, positive oil and gas industry positive policies, and actually try to do more to encourage production and building pipelines and so on than the Trudeau government did.
Yeah, I mean, I think the it is fair to say that the Trudeau government bought TMX with a low degree of enthusiasm, right? They did not really want to do that. They did it because it was the right thing to do for the country and for Alberta, and we've seen that pretty clearly since it was put into service. I think Carney and Hodgson are a little different. They're builders. Like Trudeau was not a builder. Trudeau was uh, uh, he was a pie divider, not a pie grower, and Carney's a pie grower. And I think he understands that there's value in probably maybe another pipeline, maybe if the economics are good. And he's been clear about that. He said, look, if a private sector proponent steps up and makes it a priority, we'll do everything we can to clear the way for it to make sure it is assessed, not approved, assessed in a really timely manner. That's good. Um, but Carney also understands the economics. He understands climate change, and I think what he understands really well, and what I'm encouraged by, is where to pick the fights. Right, the whole ball game is getting the oil and gas industry off its wallet and investing in these carbon capture and storage projects. It is the only way that it is going to reduce its emissions by the levels required to remain competitive, especially if we move into a world where other importers are pricing carbon, yada yada yada. You know the whole story. And so I do think that he is going to get rid of the emissions cap, as I argued in a column a little while ago, because the emissions cap is performative. It is a pair of suspenders on top of a belt, and he's going to make the fight around industrial carbon pricing, which is where it should be, and not necessarily drive the price up, but ensure that the carbon markets are working properly, ensure that the companies are paying a proper price on carbon. Because, and again, this is news to Danielle Smith, news to Brian Jean, apparently, but the best way to encourage the development of low carbon technology is with an industrial carbon price. Sorry, folks. That's how it works. And I think Carney gets that. He's going to drive the point where it needs to be driven. And he's not going to get into these sort of symbolic battles around, emissions caps and things like that. So I think he will remove some of the regulations that Danielle Smith is complaining about. He will not remove anywhere close to the number that she has demanded. And the real question for her is she going to try to go to war, which is her only move, against a prime minister who will appear to have made a lot of important concessions? And how will that go for her? She is dealing with a different cat here in Mark Carney than Justin Trudeau, and it's not entirely clear that she realizes that yet.
I would argue that it's pretty clear she doesn't, but we'll see how that plays out. Max, always appreciate you coming on. Thank you very much for this.
Yeah, thanks for the chat.